The sweltering heat of Ouagadougou greeted Ambassador Sandra Clark as she descended the steps of her private jet. The 56-year-old U.S. ambassador to West Africa had served in several nations on the continent, but this was her first direct contact with Burkina Faso since Captain Ibrahim Traoré's rise to power. The dry, dusty air of the dry season carried an additional weight that morning, the weight of the mission entrusted to her directly by the State Department. "Welcome to Burkina Faso, Ambassador Clark," said Laurent Touré, a young local diplomat assigned to her as her liaison, extending his hand. His eyes betrayed a certain apprehension that his formal posture tried to disguise. "Thank you, Mr. Touré. The trip was uneventful." Clark adjusted her glasses as she surveyed the modest airport, a far cry from the grandeur of Abidjan, where she maintained her main office. "Your hotel is prepared as requested. Discreet and secure," Laurent assured her, guiding her to a black SUV with tinted windows. "The Minister of Foreign Affairs has confirmed that your meeting is scheduled for tomorrow at 10 a.m. Inside the vehicle, the air conditioning offered temporary relief as they drove through the city. Ouagadougou lay beyond the window, a vibrant African metropolis that blended the traditional and the modern. Women in colorful outfits carried merchandise on their heads, flanked by young executives with smartphones. The heavy traffic of motorbikes and vintage cars created a chaotic symphony of honking horns. "Is the situation as tense as it seems?" Clark asked, discreetly eyeing a group of soldiers on a street corner. Laurent hesitated. Since the latest attacks on the northern border, the military presence has increased. Captain Traoré is determined to demonstrate total control. Clark nodded thoughtfully. U.S. intelligence indicated that the leader of the 2022 military coup was becoming increasingly defiant in his anti-Western, especially anti-French, rhetoric. The rapprochement with Russia and China was creating a new axis of influence in the Sahel, threatening decades of U.S. foreign policy in the region. The SUV stopped in front of the Hotel Splendid, a mid-sized establishment that had been the scene of a terrorist attack years earlier, but was now considered one of the safest in the capital. Discretion was essential. This was not an official visit, and Washington preferred it that way. In his room, Clark opened his briefcase and reviewed the documents for the 10th time. His mission was clear and delicate: to investigate Traoré's real intentions regarding the military agreements with Russia, and to assess whether there was still room for cooperation with the U.S. The reports showed recent photos of Wagner Group mercenaries in Burkinabe territory, information that the local government officially denied. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. "Ambassador," said the voice of her aide in Washington, "we have just received confirmation. It will not be just the minister. Traoré himself will be present." Clark felt the weight of the information. The young captain rarely attended meetings with Western diplomats. This could be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, or a carefully planned diplomatic trap. "Understood. Any changes to the briefing?" The secretary emphasizes that the priority is to understand the Russian move without making commitments we cannot fulfill. After hanging up, Clark walked to the window. The sun was beginning to set, tinging Ouagadougou with orange hues. Outside, children played soccer with a makeshift ball, oblivious to the complex geopolitical tensions unfolding in their city. It was for them, the ambassador thought, that so much was at stake. The evening brought a solitary meal and a failed attempt at rest. The sounds of the city, so different from those of her home in Virginia, kept her alert. Even after 3 decades in diplomacy, the eve of crucial meetings always brought the same anxiety. Tomorrow, she would face a man who represented both the hope of change for her people and a potential threat to regional stability, depending on which side of the geopolitical chessboard you looked at. And Clark knew that in this game, she could not afford to make the wrong move. Dawn in Ouagadougou brought a quick rain that settled the dust, creating that distinctive aroma of wet earth that lasted only until the sun rose in full force. Clark was already awake at 5 in the morning, reviewing her notes as she watched the city awaken from her balcony. Calls to prayer mixed with the growing noise of traffic, creating the unique soundtrack of the Burkinabe capital. "Bonjour, Madame l'Ambassadrice," greeted Aminata, the young analyst from the American embassy in Abidjan, who had arrived overnight to help her. Of Senegalese origin and educated at Georgetown, She perfectly represented the new generation of African-American diplomats that Washington was cultivating. "Good morning, Aminata. Did you get any rest?" Clark gestured to the chair across from her, where the local breakfast, including galliasses and strong coffee, was being served. "That's it. I brought the updates you requested." She slid a tablet across the table. "Our contacts confirm that Traoré has canceled all other engagements this morning. It looks like you will have his undivided attention." Clark examined the new data as he ate a bagel. Satellite images showed unusual movement at a military base near the border with Mali, the very place where informants had reported the presence of Russian instructors. "What about the demands he is likely to make? Are we authorized to make any leeway?" Aminata adjusted her hijab before replying, "Washington is willing to discuss expanding humanitarian aid and counterinsurgency training, but nothing that could be construed as validation of the coup. As for the Russians," she hesitated, "the State Department would prefer you listen rather than offer." The rest of the morning was spent in a carefully choreographed diplomatic dance. Laurent Touré arrived at 8:30 for the final briefing, bringing with him information on the expected protocol, and, more important, on Traoré's mood. "The captain is," Laurent chose his words carefully, "particularly sensitive today. There was an attack on a village in Soum province last night. 7 civilians were killed, including 2 children." Clark nodded gravely. The jihadist insurgency ravaging the country was real and brutal, a fact that complicated the American position. How could one criticize Traoré's authoritarian methods when he faced such real threats to the safety of his people? By 9:15 a.m., the convoy was ready to leave. 2 vehicles, one in front and one behind the lead SUV, in which Clark was traveling with Aminata and a security officer. The streets of Ouagadougou were busier now, with makeshift sidewalk markets selling everything from vibrant fabrics to used electronics. The Kojam Palace was renovated after the coup, Laurent explained over the radio. The captain removed many of the symbols he considered colonial vestiges. You will notice the difference. As they approached the presidential compound, the military presence became increasingly evident. Young soldiers in impeccable uniforms wielding AK-47s manned strict checkpoints. Burkina Faso flags, with their gold star on horizontal red and green stripes, fluttered everywhere, symbols of the renewed nationalism that Traoré had awakened. The security process was rigorous and somewhat humiliating, as Clark had known it would be. His diplomatic status granted a certain courtesy, but times had changed. Western diplomats no longer enjoyed automatic deference in many parts of Africa, Aminata whispered as they passed through the last checkpoint. "They're filming, probably for state television." Clark kept his expression neutral, aware that his every gesture could be edited and interpreted later. Inside the presidential complex, the signs of change were evident. Where there had once been art and furniture with a French influence, works by local artists now predominated. A huge mural depicted Pan-African heroes: Thomas Sankara, the Burkinabe revolutionary assassinated in 1987, Patrice Lumumba, and Kwame Nkrumah. They were shown into a waiting room adorned with traditional mossy sculptures. A clock on the wall read 9:58. "The captain values punctuality," Laurent said, visibly tense. At exactly 10 the double doors opened. A young uniformed officer, with impeccable posture and an intense gaze, greeted them. It was not Traoré, but his chief of staff, Major Diallo. "Ambassador Clark, President Traoré will see you now. Only you." Clark exchanged a quick glance with Aminata. This was not part of the agreed protocol. She nodded subtly, indicating that she should proceed. Major Diallo led her down a hallway decorated with photographs of the recent Days of Patriotic Engagement, events where thousands of young Burkinabés received civic military training, a controversial initiative of Traoré's. "The president expects a frank conversation," Diallo said, pausing before an ornate door. "He values honesty more than empty diplomacy." The door swung open, revealing not the expected formal conference room but a more intimate office, and standing at a large window overlooking the palace gardens was Ibrahim Traoré, younger and even more determined-looking than his photographs suggested. The first thing Clark felt was the contrast between Traoré's youth and the authority he exuded. At 35, Burkina Faso's leader was nearly 2 decades younger than the ambassador, but his eyes reflected intense experience, especially the conflicts he had endured in the north of the country before leading the coup that brought him to power. "Ambassador Clark," Traoré said in fluent French, leaning in to shake hands. His voice was deeper than Clark had expected. "Welcome to Burkina Faso, or rather, welcome back to the real country, away from the air-conditioned rooms of Abidjan." Thank you for welcoming me, President Traoré," Clark replied, also in French. "I appreciate this opportunity for direct dialogue." Traoré gestured them to sit in leather armchairs arranged around a low, handcrafted wooden table. There were no American or Burkinabe flags in the room, only authentic African art, and, Clark noted, a framed portrait of Thomas Sankara on the wall, the revolutionary many consider the African Che Guevara. A silent aide poured green tea into small, traditional ceramic cups. Traoré spoke only after the aide had left. "Let's dispense with the usual formalities, Ambassador. My time is limited, and I suspect Washington did not send you here to discuss this year's unusually warm weather." A tight smile accompanied the irony. "You came to talk about our new partners." Clark appreciated the candor. "Indeed, President. The United States is naturally interested in understanding more about the evolution of Burkina Faso's strategic alliances." "Evolution?" Traoré repeated, taking a sip of tea. "An interesting choice of words to describe a need for survival. When we took office in 2022, we inherited a country being eaten alive by terrorism, armed with obsolete equipment, and abandoned by its supposed historical allies." The ambassador sensed the rising tension, but maintained diplomatic calm. "The United States has always recognized the gravity of the terrorist threat in the Sahel region. Our cooperation—" "Your cooperation," Traoré interrupted, leaning forward slightly, "came with conditions that prioritized your geopolitical interests over our real security needs. France, the United States, the European Union, they all talked about partnership while watching our people being slaughtered." Clark knew he had to navigate carefully between defending the American position and acknowledging the Burkinabe leader's legitimate grievances. "President Traoré, I understand your frustration. The security situation has deteriorated dramatically in recent years, and perhaps our joint efforts have not been sufficiently adapted to the reality on the ground. That's exactly why I'm here, to understand your priorities and see how we can recalibrate our approach." Traoré watched Clark for a few seconds, assessing the sincerity of his words. Then, unexpectedly, he stood up. "Come with me, Ambassador. I want to show you something." Clark followed Traoré into an adjacent room, where a large table displayed a detailed map of Burkina Faso. Small red dots dotted the northern and eastern regions of the country. "Each of these dots," Traoré explained, his voice now more measured, "represents a terrorist attack in the last 18 months. Villages burned, schools closed, children who will never see their parents again." His finger traced the outline of the border with Mali. "When we asked for specific military assistance, not money, not consultants, but concrete weapons, we were met with lectures on human rights and democratic governance." Traoré's frustration was palpable, and Clark recognized the moral dilemma at play. American foreign policy often balanced precariously between values and geopolitical pragmatism. "The Russians," Traoré continued, "made a different offer. No sermons, no conditions attached to our domestic politics. Just a simple deal: weapons, training, and intelligence in exchange for certain economic concessions." "And how much did these concessions cost?" Clark asked, aware that many African countries were discovering that deals with Moscow often had hidden traps. Traoré smiled enigmatically. "Less than the cost of burying more of our citizens, certainly." Returning to his chairs, the Burkinabe leader assumed a more formal posture. "Ambassador, I am not ideological. I have no interest in the Cold War alignments that my parents experienced. Burkina Faso seeks partners who respect our sovereignty and meet our urgent needs." Clark sensed an opening. What if the United States could offer more direct assistance without the layers of bureaucracy that have hampered our cooperation? "Words," Traoré replied, shaking his head slightly. "Washington has been generous with words. Meanwhile, Russian equipment is already operational on our most vulnerable borders. The ambassador realized she was losing ground. It was time to present the offer that had been authorized as a last resort. President Traoré, I am authorized to discuss a new security assistance package, elite counterinsurgency training for your troops, surveillance technology that even your new partners cannot provide, and real-time intelligence support. For the first time in the conversation, Clark noticed a flicker of genuine interest in Traoré's eyes, but it was quickly replaced by skepticism. And in return, transparency about the nature and extent of your military cooperation with Moscow? Assurances that the Wagner Group mercenaries will not establish permanent bases on Burkinabe territory. Traoré stood abruptly, signaling that the meeting was drawing to a close. Washington still doesn't get it, Ambassador. We're not negotiating the right to defend our people. That's not a bargaining chip. Clark stood up as well, realizing that she had touched a nerve. The Russian presence was greater than Traoré was willing to admit publicly. Our job is to protect Burkina Faso not only from immediate threats, but also from long-term threats, Traoré said, walking toward the door. The Russians may not be ideal partners, but they never colonized our continent. That counts for a lot in African memory. Before Clark could respond, the door opened and Major Diallo entered, indicating that time was up. The expression on Traoré's aide's face suggested that something urgent required the president's attention. I appreciate your time, President, Clark said, extending his hand. I hope we can continue this dialogue. Traoré shook the ambassador's hand firmly. Please communicate this to your superiors in Washington, Ambassador Clark. Burkina Faso is no longer for sale. Neither are our loyalties, nor our resources. The era of leverage through conditional aid is over in the Sahel. With these final words, Clark was escorted out, aware that she had just witnessed not just the position of a leader, but the manifestation of a new geopolitical reality on the African continent. The afternoon sun in Ouagadougou shone relentlessly golden as Clark was led back to the waiting SUV. The silence between her and Aminata inside the vehicle was heavy, broken only by the hum of the air conditioning fighting the African heat. How was it? She finally asked, when they were far enough away from the presidential palace. Clark kept her eyes on the cityscape passing by the window. Street vendors, motorbikes weaving through traffic, uniformed children returning from school. Traoré is exactly what the report suggested. Intelligent, determined, and deeply suspicious of the West. She paused. But there's something else. An almost messianic conviction. He truly believes he's fighting a battle for African sovereignty, not just personal power. Aminata tapped notes on her tablet as the ambassador recounted the details of their conversation. When he mentioned the map with the terrorist attacks marked, she stopped. That matches our intelligence. The problem is real, and the French really left a vacuum when they withdrew their forces. A vacuum that Moscow is more than happy to fill, Clark added thoughtfully. The question is, to what extent is this legitimate pragmatism on Traoré's part, and to what extent is it a risky gamble with a notoriously unreliable partner? The SUV slowed as it passed a military checkpoint, a visible reminder of the tense security situation. The soldiers, mostly young, carried new weapons that Clark recognized as Russian-made. Back at the hotel, a surprise awaited them. Laurent Touré stood in the lobby, visibly nervous, accompanied by an older man who was immediately introduced as Professor Ouedraogo, a historian at the University of Ouagadougou, and, as Clark would soon learn, a former minister in the government deposed by Traoré. We need to speak in private, Ambassador, Laurent insisted, glancing nervously around. Not here. 20 minutes later, they were gathered in Clark's room, the American security officer checking the room for possible listening devices. We are in the clear, he confirmed, before positioning himself discreetly near the door. Professor Ouedraogo, with his thick-rimmed glasses and graying beard, exuded the quiet dignity typical of African intellectuals of his generation. Ambassador, what I am about to share puts me at considerable risk, he began, his voice low but firm. But I cannot remain silent when the future of my country is being jeopardized. Clark nodded, indicating that he should continue. The agreement that Traoré signed with the Russians goes far beyond what has been publicly admitted. The professor pulled some folded documents from his jacket. This was passed to me by a former student who now works at the Ministry of Mines. The documents, when examined, revealed the true scope of the strategic partnership. The Russians had secured exclusive exploration rights to three of the country's largest gold and manganese reserves, as well as prime positions for future exploration of newly discovered lithium. In return, they were providing not only weapons but also a protection force that clearly went beyond the scope of mere instructors. The Wagner Group is establishing a permanent presence, Ouedraogo explained, pointing out the technicalities of the deal. Not only to train our forces against terrorists, but to ensure Russian control over these strategic resources. It's colonialism by another name. Aminata, who had remained silent until then, interjected, "Why would Traoré accept this? He has built his entire rhetoric around sovereignty and independence." The old professor took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes wearily. "Because he is desperate. Terrorist attacks are real, Washington. Our children are dying. And when your government hesitated to provide military assistance without attaching political conditions, the Russians offered an immediate solution." Laurent, who had been standing tensely by the window, finally spoke. "There's more. Major Diallo, the man who had accompanied him today, confided to me that Traoré is under immense pressure from his own military junta. Some officers consider him too moderate, especially toward the West." "A coup within a coup?" Clark asked. "That's possible," Laurent replied, "and the Russians are cultivating relations with these more radical elements as an insurance policy in case Traoré becomes problematic for their interests." The complexity of the situation became painfully clear to Clark. Washington had misjudged Traoré's vulnerability and underestimated the aggressiveness of Russia's strategy, and now a country crucial to the fight against terrorism in the Sahel was infiltrating Moscow's orbit while maintaining the facade of autonomy. "Professor," Clark said after a few moments of reflection, "why share this with us? What do you expect us to do with this information?" Ouedraogo put his glasses back on, his gaze intense. "Because I believe Traoré is not malevolent, just inexperienced and cornered. He sees the Russians as a convenient solution, not as long-term partners. There is still time to offer an alternative that does not compromise our sovereignty." "What alternative specifically?" Aminata asked. "Genuine military support against the jihadists. No lectures on democracy. At least for now. Help us survive first. Then we can discuss how to thrive." The professor paused meaningfully. "And most importantly, a strategy for developing our natural resources that primarily benefits the Burkinabe people, not foreign corporations or Russian oligarchs." By the time the professor and Laurent left, night had fallen over Ouagadougou. From the balcony of his room, Clark watched the city lights as he mentally prepared his report for Washington. The facts were alarming, but the implications even more so. If Burkina Faso were to effectively become a Russian client state, the ripple effects across the region would be profound. Her phone rang. It was the secure line. The Secretary of State had personally requested an update. As she summarized her meeting with Traoré, Clark realized she was at a crossroads in her career. The recommendations she would make could shape American policy toward the Sahel for years to come. And as she spoke, a nagging question echoed in her mind. Was Washington truly prepared to hear the uncomfortable truth about its failure to understand the new Africa that was emerging? Dawn arrived with the muezzins calling to prayer, their melodious voices echoing through the loudspeakers of Ouagadougou's mosque. Clark had not slept. Sitting at her makeshift desk, she was finalizing a detailed report to be transmitted over secure channels directly to the State Department. Professor Ouedraogo's revelations, combined with her own observations, painted a troubling picture that demanded a swift response from Washington. At 6:30 a.m., Aminata knocked softly on the door. Her face revealed that she, too, had had a restless night. "Our flight leaves in 3 hours," she said, handing Clark a strong coffee. "The security profile has changed. We have been advised to leave the country as discreetly as possible." What happened?" "Laurent was detained for questioning in the early hours of the morning. State security agents searched his residence." She hesitated before continuing. "And there are rumors that Professor Ouedraogo has not returned home." Clark felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. The possibility that contact with the two men had precipitated this action was disturbing. "We need to postpone our departure," We can't just abandon them. Aminata shook her head. I've already consulted with our legal team. The best way to help them is from outside the country. Our options here are limited, especially if Traoré believes we're involved in some kind of espionage. The ambassador knew she was right, but the feeling of leaving vulnerable allies behind was bitter. What about the professor? Do we have any channels to locate him? We're working on it. My contact at the African Union is mobilizing the local human rights network. She paused, looking Clark directly in the eye. But we have to be realistic. If he's been detained by the security services, the incomplete sentence hung heavily between them. As they prepared to leave, Clark's secure phone rang again. It was an unexpected call from the Kosiam Palace itself. Ambassador Clark. Major Diallo's familiar voice sounded formal. President Traoré requests your presence for a farewell breakfast. A car is already en route to your hotel. It was not an invitation that could be refused without diplomatic consequences. Clark exchanged a worried glance with Aminata before accepting. I appreciate the president's gesture. I will be ready. 30 minutes later, Clark found herself once again driving through the gates of the Kosiam Palace, this time without her support staff. The official SUV drove through the manicured gardens, stopping at a side entrance she had not noticed on her previous visit. Major Diallo greeted her with an enigmatic expression. The president preferred a more informal setting for this final conversation, Ambassador. Clark was led down a hallway decorated with historical photographs, many of them depicting important moments in the country's 1960 independence, until they reached a small inner garden, where a table had been set up in the shade of a century-old mango tree. Ibrahim Traoré, wearing a simple traditional Burkinabe shirt instead of the previous day's military uniform, stood to greet her. Ambassador, thank you for accepting my last-minute invitation, he said, gesturing for Clark to sit down. The table was set with a traditional meal: coffee, fresh fruit, and tuo, millet porridge with sauce, served in traditional ceramics. It is an honor, President Traoré. I confess I am surprised by the invitation. Traoré smiled faintly as he personally poured coffee for them both. Our official conversations follow strict protocols, don't they? Sometimes it is on the sidelines of these meetings that real diplomacy happens. For a few minutes they discussed neutral topics: the architecture of the palace, renovated after the coup, the history of the mango tree they were sitting under, planted, according to Traoré, by the first president of the independent country. Clark sensed the underlying tension, knowing there was a definite purpose to this seemingly casual encounter. Finally, after a long sip of coffee, Traoré abandoned the pleasantries. I hear you had an interesting evening after our meeting, Ambassador. The conversational comment sent Clark an immediate warning. Maintaining her composure, she responded carefully. It was an evening devoted to organizing my impressions of our productive conversation. And also to gathering other perspectives on my government, it seems. Traoré set her cup down on the table, her gaze now direct and penetrating. Professor Ouedraogo is a brilliant man. He was my professor at university, you know. I have always admired his intelligence, even when we fundamentally disagreed about the path to development for our country. Clark's stomach churned, but she kept her face impassive. Burkina's academia has a reputation for excellence. It is no surprise that you, as an educated leader, value that tradition. Traoré ignored the evasion. The professor is safe, in case you are concerned. He is being treated with the respect his position deserves, but I confess I was disappointed to discover that he shared internal documents with a foreign representative. President Traoré, Clark decided to forego the circumlocution. If the purpose of this breakfast is to accuse me of espionage, I would prefer to be blunt. To his surprise, Traoré laughed, a sound of genuine amusement. Espionage? No, Ambassador. Diplomats gather information. It's part of the job. I'm not accusing you of anything other than doing your job competently. He poured himself more coffee. I'm just observing how Washington continues to bet on the wrong players on the African chessboard. Clark frowned, and Traoré continued. Professor Ouedraogo represents a generation of African intellectuals who, however well-intentioned, still see salvation in Western formulas: liberal democracy, unrestricted market economics, good governance by external standards. Traoré gestured broadly. 60 years of independence following these recipes, and where are we? Still fighting terrorism, still exporting raw materials with no added value, still dependent on foreign aid. And the alternative proposed by Moscow is better, Clark ventured, deciding that frankness would be his best strategy at that moment. Traoré smiled again, but this time there was something calculated in his expression. Russia does not have a colonial history in Africa. That is a simple fact that resonates deeply with our people. And yes, they have interests in our resources, just like you, the Chinese, the Europeans. The difference is that they do not disguise it with rhetoric about values. Why? The documents that Professor Ouedraogo shared, they are real, Traoré interrupted, surprising Clark with his frankness, but incomplete. The deal includes technology transfer and industrial training that will eventually allow Burkina Faso to process these minerals locally, rather than exporting them as raw materials, something that decades of Western partnerships have never provided. Clark remained skeptical, but he saw a logic to Traoré's approach that Washington tended to underestimate. To many Africans, Western criticism of Russian or Chinese influence sounded like hypocrisy, coming from powers that had for centuries extracted wealth from the continent under various pretexts. And the Wagner Group mercenaries? They have a questionable track record in other African countries. I prefer to call them private security companies, Traoré replied, with a wry glint in his eye. Not unlike American companies like the former Blackwater, wouldn't you agree? Clark acknowledged the rhetorical maneuver, but decided not to pursue the issue. Instead, he tried a different approach. If I may be frank, President Traoré, what exactly do you want to communicate to Washington through this conversation, assuming you knew that the information shared by the professor would be included in my report? Traoré stood, inviting Clark to walk through the garden. The roses growing there were a reminder of the French influence that once dominated the country. What I want to communicate is simple, Ambassador. Burkina Faso is not closing its doors. We are simply recalibrating the terms of our engagement with the world. He stopped near a small fountain. For decades, we have accepted aid with political conditions that undermined our autonomy. Now we are exercising the right to choose our partners based on our immediate needs. What if Washington is willing to reevaluate its approach? Clark asked, thinking of the recommendations he had already included in his report. Then we will be receptive, Traoré replied promptly. But with one crucial difference: as genuine partners, not as a country that needs to be told how to govern itself. At the end of the meeting, Clark was surprised by one last gesture from Traoré. The Burkinabe leader handed her a small object wrapped in traditional cloth. A personal gift, he explained. Open it when you're on the plane. The return to the hotel and subsequent departure for the airport took place under the watchful eye of Traoré's security. Aminata, visibly relieved to see Clark return safely, expressed concern about the unexpected encounter. What did he want? She asked, as the private jet taxied for takeoff. Clark reflected on the complex diplomatic choreography of the past 24 hours. To send a message, to establish terms, and, interestingly, to keep the doors open. It was only when they were safely in the air that Clark opened Traoré's gift. It was a small bronze sculpture, a traditional representation of a crocodile, a symbol of wisdom in Mossi culture. Accompanying it was a handwritten note, to remind you that even fearsome predators can coexist in the same river, so long as they respect each other's territories. As the plane headed west toward Ivory Coast, Clark gazed out the window at the arid Sahel landscape. Burkina Faso was behind her, but the implications of what she had witnessed would follow her to Washington. Her final report would be read at the highest levels of the American government. She would need to find the words to describe not only the facts, Russia's growing influence, its strategic vulnerabilities, the complex loyalties at play, but also something more subtle and perhaps more important: the transformation of Africa that was taking place, a transformation to which powers that had for centuries dictated terms were now being forced to listen. And as Clark prepared his notes, he reflected on the silence he had maintained when he left Traoré's office the day before, a silence that signified neither defeat nor acceptance, but the recognition of a new reality that required not just different words but a fundamentally new understanding. In his pocket, the small bronze crocodile seemed to weigh more than its physical size suggested. It was a tangible reminder that in the great game of global influence, the rules were changing, and so were the players. And perhaps Clark's silence was the most eloquent response possible. The silence of someone who understands that sometimes you have to stop talking in order to truly start listening.